right, hello everyone. Welcome. It is my absolute pleasure this morning to introduce our speaker for the Global Mosse Lecture Series, Dr. Chad S.A. Gibbs. Chad is an assistant professor and the Zucker-Goldberg Endowed Chair in Holocaust Studies at the College of Charleston, where he serves as director of the Zucker-Goldberg Center for Holocaust Studies. Chad's research focuses on Jewish resistance, oral history, localized histories of perseverance, and Holocaust pedagogy. His first book, Survival at Treblinka, Geography, Gender, and Social Networks in Jewish Resistance, which he received an advance copy of only last week, and which we'll have the pleasure to hear more about just shortly, was recently named first runner-up for the George L. Mosse First Book Prize. In it, Gibbs reassesses Jewish resistance at Treblinka, and exploring not only the uprising of August 2nd, 1943, but also the conditions that made resistance possible, with particular attention to the roles of social networks, camp geography, and Jewish women. Chad has an exceptionally impressive research portfolio. His work has been supported by institutions including Yad Vashem, the Fortunoff Archive, the USC Center for Advanced Genocide Research, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and the George L. Mosse Program in History, among others. Chad is also engaged in several exciting new research projects. First, he plans to extend his analysis of survival at Treblinka to examine life after the revolt and the ways Holocaust memory and experience were transmitted within survivor families. Alongside this, he is collaborating with Dr. Ashley Walters on a project that traces deeply intertwined transnational histories of Kalushiner Jews in Charleston and Poland across the 19th and 20th centuries. Finally, I would be remiss not to mention Chad's singular kindness and generosity as a mentor, colleague, and friend. During my time as a postdoctoral fellow here at College of Charleston, I experienced firsthand the way that he leads with kindness, something that is not always common across academia. Chad is an extraordinary collaborator who approaches scholarship as a collective endeavor and who is deeply invested in the success of those around him. He creates space for ideas, supports emerging scholars with genuine care, and models the kind of intellectual generosity that makes our field stronger. It's been a true privilege to work with him and to learn from his example, both as a historian and a teacher. And I'm deeply grateful for his mentorship. And Chad, we are all deeply grateful to have you giving us this lecture today. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you so much for that intro. And I just want to thank Hana for that intro and Sky Doney for co-hosting and co-sponsoring these talks now for what is 5 years. I find myself in the strange position of talking about my book as the 10th installment of our Mosse Charleston new book series. A little self-serving to include your own book in it, but that's the forum you get to have, so why not take it? So I'm really thankful to be in the company of those authors that we've had, from David Harrisville to Catherine Brackney to now myself, and just very honored to be on that list as well. So I will start by sharing some slides and going into a discussion of my new book. And thank you all for being here as well. So I wanted to begin by trying to talk about what we see at Treblinka and how even that is part of our understandings of this place and the difficulty of doing history at Treblinka. So this is an amazing aerial drone shot of the memorial that exists at Treblinka today, taken by my friend Jeremy Burson of the National World War II Museum just recently. And part of our issue with reconstructing history at Treblinka is that this is all that remains, above ground at least. Dr. Carolyn Sturdy-Calls has done amazing work showing us that there is more evidence to this place than we've maybe realized previously, or that we have taken for granted the idea that there is nothing even beneath the ground. And we're seeing that that isn't true, just like in Jacob Flaws's work, who will talk after me in response to this presentation. He's showing us that we can find so much beyond this area as well. But digging into the history of Treblinka, one of the things that we have to contend with is the lack of a physical camp to tour that we might find at a place like Auschwitz. So we must go back into our methodological toolkit and our testimonial toolkit to find new ways to dig into this history and find out more than has been given to us in perhaps the last 80 years. And some of those ways that I've tried to do this are through spatial research, gender analysis, and social network analysis, kind of the three prongs of my subtitle of the book. So in spatial research, I'm trying to explore how did Jewish prisoners get from place to place? If you look at Treblinka as, if it helps you to kind of step back from the horrors of the Holocaust and imagine it for a moment as a very controlled environment like a prison, where a prisoner is allowed to be where they sleep and where they work and the place in between at certain times of day, and anything else is subject to suspect from the guards. So how do we put together inside of Treblinka a form of resistance that isn't caught out by being in the wrong place at the wrong time under the lethal conditions of control inside an extermination camp? And next, looking at that same geography, thinking of where were women involved in resistance, how did they help tear down these spatial restrictions? How did Jews use gender beliefs on behalf of the guards against them to foment resistance? And how did social network analysis play into both of these things? So how did relationships between prisoners get built? And then how were those relationships actually leveraged in order to actuate resistance? So I'll move on from there to thinking about early resistance and networks. And one of the things that I wanted to do in my book was kind of pull back from, yes, the story of Treblinka in terms of resistance is so much the August 2nd, 1943 revolt. But I wanted to know, how do you get from extermination camp conditions to really well organized and well planned revolt? That can't happen overnight. There must be, I had thought, a long backstory. And in what I had seen in the work of others before I started on this project, there was some coverage, but I had a feeling maybe there could be more understanding of that. So, in the earliest days of the camp, starting at the top of this list that I want to talk through here, prisoners found it very hard to build networks of trust. Guards attempt to use fear against Jewish prisoners. They attempt to use that to leverage informants or to just keep resistance from forming. And the very geography of the camp as it stands in its early form is difficult to build bonds across the entire prisoner work details. So I'll try to point out some things here. So in the early phases of the camp, and you see this early Treblinka extermination camp 1942 map, you have two areas labeled as Camp 1. They kind of run together. They are this lower and to the side portion here. This is sometimes called the living camp. It has a lot of different names. It can get quite confusing. Then some parts of it will have different names, but for our purposes today, it's Camp 1 as the living area, quote unquote, and Camp 2 as the so-called death camp, the area in which the gas chambers are located. This is the old gas chamber building in Camp 2, and then where the mass graves and later pyres for destroying bodies were also located. These two parts of the camp have their own prisoner workforces that are not allowed under any circumstances to speak to each other. And for all but one prisoner, no one is supposed to be allowed back in Camp 1 once they've become a resident of Camp 2. This is thought of as some form of secrecy and control by German guards. So only one individual is allowed to cross from Camp 2 to Camp 1, and that is a man named Yankel Viernik. He is a Jewish prisoner who is foreman of the construction detail, and he becomes deeply involved in resistance. And maybe some of you in this audience have seen his model of Treblinka that is today at the Ghetto Fighters House Museum he created for the trials after the war. But in this early phase, you can tell a couple of few things. In this map, you've got Camp 1, Camp 2. We see that divide, and we can see how that divide changes over time. Camp 1 actually grows to take over some of Camp 2's space. The fences are formalized. There's a berm built in between the two camps at certain areas. And The living areas of Camp One are vastly built out. In that Camp One area, you have two different prisoner living areas. There's this building, which is marked number 12 on the map, if, in case you don't see the cursor. And 12 is the sort of, at this point in the camp's existence, it's called the Hofjuden or court Jews barracks. This is taken from medieval German Jewish life, the concept of a court Jew being like a privileged individual. It's a SS version of humor for calling these prisoners by court Jews. It means that they're like prominent prisoners or individuals with a job that makes them relatively more safe than others. And in the early phases of the camp's existence, number 17 over here is the building in which many of the everyday prisoners sleep at night. No, not even any bunks. It's just on the ground inside that building. Those are the individuals who sort the clothes of those who've been murdered inside Treblinka and prepare the goods taken from them to be sent back to Germany. So the non-skilled laborers who the Germans consider quite expendable. And in that early phase of the camp, you have basically two large problems with trying to bring about the building of a resistance conspiracy. So number one, huge camp turnover. German guards are still killing prisoners in the hundreds on a daily basis. They have not decided upon having a static workforce. Instead, they're just bringing in some workers off of arriving trains, and then at the end of a day, sending those people to the gas chambers as well, and it prevents any sort of like stable prisoner population, except for those who are here in the so-called Hofjuden barracks. And the other large problem is that when these two camp populations are separated, they can't communicate with each other very well, and they don't have a sort of sense of shared fate. And one of the things that goes on at Treblinka is that the camp is thought of as inefficient. And Dr. Irmfried Eberl, the first commandant of Treblinka, a man who was a medical doctor and had come from the T4 program, like the euthanasia program, like many of the guards, is fired by Aktion Reinhard leadership for not running an efficient camp and for not being able to handle the number of human beings, number of Jews being sent to Treblinka on a daily basis, for falling behind and for word getting out about what Treblinka is because of the way he's running it. He's relieved, and a man named Franz Stangl is put in charge. In his reorganization, we have new difficulties arrive for the prisoners, but we also have new opportunities arise for the prisoners. So part of his reorganization decision is to keep a static prisoner workforce and create a single prisoner barracks, which is labeled, right here, number 22, this whole barracks building. So now we have erased the mental and physical divide between so-called Hofjuden and everyday workers inside of Camp One. And this is not just something that historians have recognized in understanding sort of how the coming together of these two groups is a big change in resistance. This is also a matter even discussed in testimonies. There's one former prisoner remarked that it was at that point when the Hofjuden came into the resistance conspiracy that they even stopped using the kind of term Hofjuden about themselves. They stopped feeling that they were separate from the fate of other prisoners, and they began to cooperate in the idea of bringing about resistance. But as a sort of wrapping up here, so this change in geography brings prisoners together in a way that allows them to better plan the idea of fomenting a revolt, erases mental divides between prisoners of Camp One, so now they're all in on the same sort of conspiracy, or at least attempt to begin one, and it gives them the ability to communicate. What had been going on before this point were small scale or even small group escapes. Prisoners, largely those who were not in the prominent barracks, those who lived in this building right here, had been escaping um, up to the switch to a single barracks, and that is a lot of why the German guards decided, from Stangl himself decided to create this single barracks, marked right here, was to forestall those escapes. And once you no longer have individuals who are of a mind to resist and of a mind to try to get out of the camp, escaping on a daily basis, you also stop drawing off the resistance-minded people. So, as a last thing on this slide, I would say that Stangel's attempts to end escape actually are kind of the first turn toward large-scale resistance. And one part of that large-scale resistance is finding people that early conspirators believed they could trust and trying to bring them into the camp and make them part of resistance. And that's how I get to these two pictures. The man in the left-hand picture on the far left is Alfred Galewski in a pre-war photograph taken at a ski resort, we believe. Alfred Galewski was the highest ranking Jewish prisoner inside of Treblinka. The Germans gave him the prisoner title Lagerälteste, or camp elder. So he is the head of the prisoner work details, and he's really well trusted by the Germans. And he has the ability to assign people to different work details, and he has even the ability, while standing as trains are being unloaded at Treblinka, he has the ability to pick people off of the train, tell the guards that they need this person because that person has X, Y, or Z skill. So he actually sees, getting off the train one day, a man named Samuel Reisman, who is photographed in the center here, the right-hand picture. Samuel Reisman and Alfred Galewski's daughters had attended the same underground school inside the Warsaw Ghetto. This is where they had gotten to know each other. And Reisman is getting off the train, and Galewski comes up with an excuse to say to the guards, we need him. He can fulfill a function for you. Keep him alive. And Reisman's family, his wife and daughters, end up going directly to the gas and are murdered. And Reisman comes up to Galewski at the end of the day and kind of accosts him with the, I would imagine, shouted phrase, why have you kept me alive? Why have you saved me in this place? I don't want to live here after my family has been killed. And Galewski says to him in no uncertain terms that Reisman recalls later in his own testimony that he did not save him just to keep him alive in that place. He saved him to sell your life at a higher price, to make him a part of a resistance conspiracy and to actually, build a network of people he could trust in resistance. So we have that in the prisoners and the survivors' own words, that this was the real purpose. So what this means is that so much as there is a thing called selection, and I put it in air quotes at the top of the slide here, so much as there is such a thing as that, because it's not really a large scale, hundreds of people being brought into the camp sort of situation. It's really ones, twos, and threes for replacements of prisoners who've passed away, who've taken their own lives, who've been murdered by the guards. It's very minuscule, the amount of people who are coming into Treblinka alive and staying that way through even a whole day. And so for how much it does work at all, the sources indicate that Jews are deeply involved in that selection. They're bringing in friends, relatives, individuals they think they can trust. And that is actually helping build a resistance conspiracy, because how do you build a bond of trust inside of a place as controlled as Treblinka and as lethal as Treblinka? And one of the ways it's visible that they did so was by bringing in those people they had known from pre-war life. There's a flip side to this, however, and it's I think one of the things that's been looked away from in the history of Treblinka that's maybe difficult to speak about, and that is that prisoners also took violent actions against those they felt that they could not trust. So there was forming and there was also preserving social networks. And the preserving of those social networks goes into violence between prisoners in the form of killing believed informants at night in barracks. So we have a very interesting group of testimonies about killings inside the barracks. Samuel Willenberg is quoted here at the bottom of the screen. And Richard Glazar, another survivor of Treblinka, actually wrote about the existence of a sort of camp court where suspected informants would be put on trial, and if found guilty, they would be killed by prisoners, and their deaths would be passed off as a suicide. This has, however distasteful and difficult it is to hear about these sort of things, it has another purpose in resistance as well, because from the moment the belief in a real form of uprising as the future of the prisoners inside Treblinka takes hold, prisoner suicides actually drop off. And some of the prisoners begin to worry maybe the Germans will catch on that we're planning something because people are not taking their own lives anymore. And one of the ways that they forestall the prisoner guards actually catching on to this was by passing off those killed informants as suicides. It actually gives cover to the lack of suicide from the moment that the resistance conspiracy is really taking hold. This, over time, bringing in people ones and twos and finding certain whole groups that are trusted, it has the ability to kind of move prisoners, again, through both that selection and then through the actions of Camp Elder Galevsky. It has the effect of moving trusted prisoners into various important places throughout the camp, so that you have a network that is both interpersonal and spatial. You're moving trusted people into different locations, moving them into those locations by giving them work details that have access to those locations. And then as you have them in the right place, you can say as a conspiracy that you have total access to the camp through the ability to move people in between work details. So this is both forming, preserving social networks, and then giving those networks access to space through the manipulation of work details with the participation of the camp elder who is in on the resistance. So we're up to that point. We can then look at, one of the things I do in the book is look at several plans for resistance that fell apart before the revolt conspiracy that does come off on August 2nd, 1943. And I look particularly at three failed uprising plans before that successful revolt and try to pull apart from those, what did they lack? If they failed for some reason, was it because they lacked some preparation that the fourth, possibly fourth, at least fourth plan did have? And in looking at those, we find, of course, that luck is an enormous factor. There was an earlier plan led by Dr. Julian Korozicki, who is caught in possession of valuables by one of the ranking guards and killed. Well, they're about to kill him, and he takes cyanide so that they cannot get the resistance plan out of him. So his passing, his death, seems to be more of a terrible luck incident. But these other, at least two plans, fall apart because they lack access to space. They lack a full network. At one point, there is a plan led by a man named Capo Rakovsky. Rakovsky is commander of a group that sorts belongings and helps people off of the train and directs them where to go off of the train. He doesn't appear to have a full ability to speak to and to network with all of the camp's prisoners. So lacking that, his idea of a conspiracy is to just get a small group to foment like a large scale escape. And his large scale escape plan is again foiled by him being caught in possession of valuables, which was always against the rules because the Germans wanted those valuables for themselves. And he is killed. And Capo Rakovsky is replaced again as Lagerälteste by the return of Alfred Galevsky, who had been kind of sick with possibly typhus up to that point. So Galevsky comes back. He has complete access to the whole network of prisoners. He's put people that he knows and can trust in all these different work details. And he's also able to use his ability as camp elder to create what I term places of resistance. So I'm thinking specifically here, very much in terms of what spatial historians call place making. So not just a a location, but a actual like created use of a location. So I'll give an example that I find have always found really, really amazing about the prisoner ploys for control of space at Treblinka. This building all the way over to the right-hand bottom corner is sometimes called the Pferdestall or Storage Barracks B. It's Pferdestall is German for horse barn. It never had horses in it. There were horses at Treblinka, but they were actually put somewhere else. This is called a horse barn because of the way it looks. It's just architecturally looks that way. And it's used for storing the clothing and valuables of people who've been murdered in the gas chambers at Treblinka. And that clothing and material will eventually be sent back to Germany for use by the Third Reich. But Jews, including Alfred Galewski, convinced the German guards that the building is infested with lice, and that they should not go in that building because they'll get lice themselves and they could get sick with typhus. They used the Germans' own belief in Jews as carriers of lice to create this idea. They're like, oh, it's got all this Jewish clothing in it. It's full of lice because you know how Jews have lice and are this way. You only need to look at the propaganda posters used by the Third Reich to show how they did believe in this sort of thing. So it's using their own propaganda against them in quite an interesting way. And it works so well that Jews are able to use this building, Storage Barracks B or the Pferdestall, as a place of recovery. They're able to make it into kind of a makeshift hospital. And one individual even spends 17 days in that building with a bullet wound, never observed by the guards at all, and is able to be smuggled out of the camp, is able to escape the camp with the help of others after having spent 17 days in that building that guards are afraid to enter. This is kind of what I'm referring to when I say creating places of resistance. They're making that space into a place of resistance through the ways in which they actually control territory by controlling what the guards think of that territory. Another incredibly important example is right here. Building number 2 on this map is the camp armory in between these two that are labeled number 1. These are both SS buildings, the SS sort of barracks building and SS lunch area, or you might even call it something of a day room. And in front of it, there are two sort of darkened long shapes here that are meant to denote like flower planters. Uh, Prisoners, Galewski most likely himself, come up with the idea of asking the guards, well, why don't we put in some flower planters in front of the barracks? It will help cut down on the smell. Jacob's work especially talks a great deal about how bad the smell of this camp was. You can only imagine with bodies being burned by the thousands on a daily basis. And they come up with the idea of planting these lupine pots in front of the barracks. And that gives Jewish prisoners who are assigned to the work detail, and that assignment being done by Alfred Galewski himself, gives those prisoner work details the ability to be in front of the SS armory and barracks without any reason to be suspect by the guards because they have been assigned there as part of construction. After an earlier prisoner ploy had gotten them a key to the armory, they used that ability to be near that building to get into the armory with a key, bring out those weapons from the armory and hand grenades, and put them in the very construction carts that are being used to create these planters, and move them throughout the camp. And where they move them is one of the first places to bring up discussion of women's position in this revolt and how women are so deeply pivotal to the creation of resistance here, though we've known so little about their lives inside the camp for so long. So Jewish women inside of Treblinka never make up more than about 40 or 50 individuals in both Camps 1 and Camp 2, or the living area and the death camp area. In the living camp, they live inside the same large barracks building that I've zoomed in on here, and they work in the laundry and the camp kitchen right here. They basically work in stereotypically gendered professions inside the camp, and that is how their presence is justified to the guards, or the reason these work details exist. There's work that is traditionally done by women to do, so they create women's work details in Camp 1, and they eventually do so in Camp 2 as well. And in Camp 1, one of the ways that women are participating in the revolt is by keeping an eye on the guards as they go in and out of the SS barracks to clean that barracks or to do the SS laundry. So they are eyes and ears of the revolt. They have a courier-esque position, much like in ghetto resistance. They are less suspect by the German guards, the testimonies seem to show. They don't fear women as much, and the prisoner conspiracy is very, very willing to use that against them. And one of the ways in which they do that in Camp 1 is once they've spirited these weapons out of the armory, they actually hide them in a pair of places that will allow prisoners to come and go from that place, and to conceal objects without the watchful eye of the guards. So one is place 5A here is the potato storage area. They take some of the weapons there, and prisoners are able to go to that spot during the day as transiting back and forth to the kitchens. So they can put some weapons there to hide them. And they also hide the lion's share of those stolen weapons in 5B here, which is the kitchen, which is staffed by women. Uh, the German guards, again, I'll just repeat, did not fear women as much. So placing the weapons with them kind of meant that they were almost beyond suspect, weren't as closely watched or suspect of resistance as male prisoners were, uh, to the foolishness of the guards. So women are hiding and distributing weapons on the day of the revolt in Camp 1. And in Camp 2, one of the more powerful things that this book reveals is the existence of a camp brothel that we have sort of long looked away from. The sources existed. I've put together a few sources that show the existence of a camp brothel in Treblinka, and that at least one historian did have access to this material, but did not bring it up in previous publication. But that brothel in Camp 2 on the day of the revolt, here it is on the map, number 10. It is not a brothel at all hours. It is also a sleeping area for capos, but at certain hours of the day it becomes a camp brothel. And the women forced to endure that hellish place actually participate in revolt by distracting 8 guards, it's said in these sources, who put down their rifles, and a Jewish man is able to run in at the time of the revolt, grab those rifles that they've put down, and actually take them into the fight. So we have 2 areas in which women's existence and participation in the revolt is deeply, deeply important, though we haven't spent a great deal of time looking at that to this point in history. And one of the things that I wanted to cover in this book was sort of asking the question of why have we known so little about Jewish women at Treblinka? And one of the things that is very important about that, I think, is masculinity, and looking at this particularly through the lens of what Mary Louise Roberts, one of my advisors at UW-Madison, called the concept of gender damage. The idea that elder, very traditional Jewish men who would be asked to recall these histories of what happened at Treblinka to Jewish women would have faced the consequence of sort of a re-damaging of their masculine sense of self if they go awful far down the road of describing what actually happened at Treblinka. So we see in their testimonies, particularly in the oral history format, we see a marked reluctance to actually discuss what happened to Jewish women. We see that sometimes in just plain silence, and we see it sometimes in erasure. So I've got some individuals on this screen, and some are more open than others about what took place in Treblinka and elsewhere. Adek Stein is a testimony that has always stuck with me because it's clear in his interview that he is actually speaking to a small audience of family members. And as in his own words, it seems those were women from his family. And he's asked about sexual violence during the Holocaust, and he says, "I don't want to recall that in front of these girls. It's too drastic. I don't want to harm them." So he's kind of still maintaining this role of protector, even as it regards giving an oral history interview years and years after the fact. His interviewer tries to get him to go on, but he basically refuses, and the topic changes, and we don't hear more from him about what he may have been able to tell us. Jonas Kornhendler, for his part, was in Treblinka for a much shorter period of time. He escapes before the revolt, and his testimony is a bit more frank about the existence of women prisoners, their sort of positionality, but he doesn't know much about the revolt. He's not a part of it. And he tells us more because maybe it's that he has uh, less scarring about the existence of these facts. He's not as long term. Abraham Bamba is a very interesting testimony in this. Of course, many people will know him perhaps if they've seen Claude Lanzmann's monumental film Shoah. He's a major testimony giver in that film. And in his interview with the USC Shoah Foundation, he actually gives me the title of chapter 4. He says there was no women in Treblinka, even though if we go back to that spatial record, we can show that Bamba would have had a daily interaction with Jewish women prisoners. He would have had to walk by them. He would have had to most likely receive his meals from them. And if we're forced to look for a reason why he might want to avoid or even like erase their very presence in the camp, we have to return to the idea that perhaps it's because he's defending himself from the stories he might have to tell if he sort of openly addresses the existence of the camp or of what goes on in the camp, I should say. So what men are willing to say, that goes both for male historians and male witnesses. It has a lot to do with the format that they're giving their testimony in. I found that individuals were much more honest in early pre-war written testimony, more honest and open about what happens to women in general in written testimony than in oral testimony, and much more honest and frank and forthright in the years just after the war, when they are older and writing maybe late life narratives. There's uh, less fewer individuals will address exactly what happened to women in those kind of accounts. And it also, I believe, and I mark in the book that the gender of the interviewer may also play a role. And most of these older men were interviewed. It's over 70% of these men were interviewed by a woman. And that sort of interplay, it seems, may have something to do with what they're willing to say, especially when compared to interviews taken with men instead. So we've got a lot of different reasons to cover, and maybe we can go into that in Q&A as to why we know what we know, the reluctance of some to discuss what exactly went on, and how that's really obscured what we've known of women's lives inside Treblinka for so long. So, getting to the revolt, I actually cover the revolt and women's involvement in it and the aftermath of that process. And then I take on, in the last full chapter of the book, the concept of surviving Treblinka, and just how many people did survive Treblinka. So the book in the top right corner here, The Death Camp Treblinka, is an edited volume by Alexander Donat. And Donat's book is a bringing together of several testimonies, and also he writes his own sections. There's a section taken from In the Fields of Treblinka by Rachel Auerbach. And he also gives over 8 pages of his book to a list of survivors of Treblinka that has, for some good on nearly 80 years, been something of a immovable object in Treblinka research. The idea that there were, just because he had listed it, 68 survivors, people just sort of took that as a given. One of the things I try to point out in the book, I was very happy that the publisher allowed me to print a quite large appendix of survivor names. So I've found in the process of this research 262 survivors of the death camp at Treblinka 2. And they are in different categories in my book. So we have 70 survivors of the revolt itself, 83 who escaped the camp before the revolt, 88 who were what I call through transport survivors. They were in the camp for a very short period of time, and then 21 unique, unknown, or questionable accounts. There's a few different categories under that 21, but that sort of simplifies things for today. Of these individuals, there are Alexander Knott knew of 2 women survivors of Treblinka. Those 2 women survived the revolt. And I've added 7 more women to the list, though those individuals had gotten out before the revolt itself, so they were in the camp for a much shorter period of time. What I do also in this survival area of the book is try to sort of push at how many sources there are to do new research on Treblinka and to localize this idea of survival or survivorship. So to make a list of survivors of any place, you have to define surviving that place. It's a requisite to put a name on a list. So what I do is create that definition and use it to sort of probe the power of Treblinka. How far does the power of this camp go? What are the boundaries of it? Where do we stop the considerations of survival? And what does that tell us about how this camp operated and its wider significance in its geography? I think I'll leave that again as something that we could expand on in Q&A if folks would like. But I think that it has deployability for wider Holocaust studies. We could look at many different sites in this way. We could look at any camp or ghetto or other experience of the Holocaust and think about what is the geography of that survival? What are the bounds of that place in reality if we don't just accept that the camp ends at the fences? Well, how far in addition to those fences are the guards effective, or so on and so forth? And the final thing that I comment on in that chapter that I think is going to be very important to us as time goes on is how we talk about last survivors of certain places, particularly as our survivors are leaving us so rapidly these days. News media is constantly defining survival for historians and constantly kind of coming up with ways to discuss what it means to survive a certain place. And they're labeling people the last survivor of this and the last survivor of that. So news media will define survivorship of certain experiences for us if we don't prefigure that coming wave of discussion. So that's kind of one of the last things that I comment on in that chapter is ways that we might want to be prepared for that as the years go on. So in summary, I just kind of bring things together here near the end. Survival at Treblinka is trying to offer a new assessment of resistance at this camp that highlights the lives of women and why we've really known so little about that over time. And I think a lot of that has to do with what historians were willing to say and what survivors were willing to say. The methods also run into the spatial. I do definitely consider myself a spatial historian, and I really focus in on minute spaces. Jacob Flaws is also here today to comment, and Jacob's work is looking at the huge expanses of space around Treblinka, and my work is really room by room. How can you define places of resistance as it regards just getting access to a certain building or a certain room or What does the camp brothel lend to resistance, and so on and so forth. So also, we've already just discussed those localized definitions of survivorship. And I want to end on the note that raising the number from 68 to 262 survivors doesn't at all lessen the massive lethality of a place like Treblinka, where probably around 925,000 human beings were murdered by Nazi Germany. So this doesn't change the scope of destruction of Jews at this place, but hopefully a new list of 262 survivors, and noting that it will never be a complete list, that names will always be coming to us as different sources are plumbed in new ways, hopefully by the spurring of this research. We will never be done naming those individuals, and far more sources exist for us to do new work on this camp than we maybe had previously recognized. So as I reach the end here, this is the cover of the book, QR for it. It ships this month. I'm incredibly excited to be talking about my first book here. I really thank the series. I thank Sky Doney, Hannah Green for coordinating today, and Jacob for providing comment. And I will stop share and hand over to Jacob and get ready for his utter destruction of the book, I'm sure. Uh, but thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Chad, for sharing your book. So I'll just get right into it. Survival at Treblinka is one of those rare books that does not just enter the conversation, but it creates new conversations entirely. Sometimes you get done with a book and you think, well, what were their sources? What's the scholarship like in this? Chad's book, your scholarship is clear and present and undeniable in this particular text. I think it's a testament to the depth of your research to say that your work has altered my own perceptions and understanding of the camp, the resistance, and the survivors. And so, someone who's an expert on Treblinka, I took a lot from your book. So people who aren't as familiar with this space will certainly get a lot, as will experts alike. Chad does a lot of exceptional things in the book. The first one that really struck out to me was the redefinition of survivorship and the meticulous list that Chad includes as his appendix, but in my mind is really one of the stars of the show. Having tracked down survivors for other research I've done, I recognize the intensive and laborious process that Chad had to embark upon to compile this list. But as he even notes, the list, impressive as it is not the focal point of the effort. Rather, it is highlighting the breadth and the depth of experiences of survival that both united but also differentiated survivors of the death camp. Chad has chosen to create categories of survivors that allow him to group like experiences together, but also help the reader understand the different timescales at play. Escape survivors trickle out of the camp in fits and starts through its early phase. Of course, the major pulse of survivors occurs during the revolt of August 2nd, 1943. But Chad also defines a third category of through transport survivors that you mentioned during your talk, some of which happened very late in the camp's existence. And it's this last category broadly, and the term specifically through transport survivors, which I think will impact future scholarship and promises to reshape how we understand survival at Reinhard camps, but also at other locations of incarceration and mass murder during the Holocaust. One of the areas Chad has preempted some of the discussion that his book is likely to generate is his definition of survival itself. I can tell that, Chad, you wrestled with it most in terms of this through transport category, but it's certainly something you deal with in this portion on defining survival. I found it extremely compelling and frankly accurate to suggest that survival at Treblinka meant setting feet inside the space and making it out again. Treblinka's sole purpose was the destruction of Jewish life. A Nazi effort to erase all traces of the people brought there resulted in the deaths of nearly 1 million people in less than a year and a half. Spatially speaking, to step foot inside such a space that was sectioned off from the outside world and has the sole purpose being your annihilation, and to escape that near certainty of death is a miracle in itself and is, in fact, the very definition of survival, if there ever was one. You also make an exceptional point that to call someone a survivor should be a starting point, a door to further understanding that person's path forward. The episodic version of survivalship that you talk about will certainly resonate. Another comment on the survival piece. I appreciate, though that feels like not strong enough of word, but I appreciate your delicate touch, your humanity, and your openness in defining survivors, but also in recognizing the questionable nature of some sources and your inability to confirm details of others. This was the nature of survival at Treblinka, and your honest and humane approach struck me as incredibly appropriate and respectful of everyone who encountered this space. But it is also appropriate in terms of the difficult nature of the work you undertook in compiling a survivor list in the first place. Again, that feeling can be kind of a rush, tracking down names in unexpected places and finding corroborating accounts in others. But it's also extremely frustrating and painstaking seeing a mention here, but the dates are off, or the sources can't be found, or the spellings aren't the same everywhere, which I know is an issue that obviously you came up with or came across. But that you are upfront about these struggles, but that you still dedicate yourself to that important task is admirable. The delicacy and the honesty also permeated elsewhere in your work. Namely, here I'm talking about the section dealing with identifying women at Treblinka and the understanding that a brothel existed there. Not only do you handle it with a deft touch in your own way, in your own language, but the ability to switch between difficult content and then how we analyze that content historically and objectively is a strength of your book. What I found moving was how you navigate the tricky landscape of trying to explain why men survivors of Treblinka erased women from the narrative, especially later on. You mentioned many reasons this might have happened, but the most compelling for me was the concept of protecting the honor or the legacy of these women by not going there in order to spare themselves and others from shame associated with this type of gendered violence. To quote the book, our long misunderstanding of women's roles at Treblinka results from an unwillingness to confront sex and sexual violence on the part of male survivors and later historians. Back to my thoughts here, it is a systematic and institutionalized erasure, but one without direct blame needing to be assigned, but rather a sensitive understanding of why that happened. What struck me about that was that you were able to give voice to these women and their experiences, brutal though they may be, while also maintaining that decency and respect. Your observation that a brothel existed and the methodology you use to prove its existence is groundbreaking, both in terms of spatially identifying the place, but also interpreting the silences and reading between the lines of testimony to get to the truth. The approach more generally is certain to be replicated in other places, both as a way to understand survival and the brutality and violence that survivors, and of course those who did not survive, had to face. At Treblinka specifically, it's powerful not only that you give voice and agency to women, but beyond that, you show how they used spaces to affect resistance and coordinate in the larger plot that was afoot. These were not passive victims or even people with agency in the basic sense of the word, but they were more than that. They were smart, intuitive, assertive, and proactive in working towards their own survival, but perhaps even more so the survival of others. As you mention in the book, many of the women at the brothel who helped secure weapons, for example, did not make it out during the revolt, but their selfless work in the face of brutal violence certainly ensured that others did. This agency, again, agency doesn't feel like a strong enough word for what I mean here, but this agency certainly was a factor in the organizing committee and the resistance and revolt they planned. Again, not simply agency, but spatial maneuvering, social networking, and literally mapping a revolt plan and path towards survival fundamentally reassesses how we should view Jewish survival at Treblinka more broadly and the revolt specifically. The planning and layers of resistance were nothing short of ingenious, and using spaces to their advantage and flipping the tide of their arrangements to work for themselves shows a level of controlled and measured resistance that is counter to narratives that are often presented in the Revolt of Treblinka. For example, in the earlier phases of the camp, escapes could happen more frequently because of the scattered spatial organization and the more generally the chaos of the camp during the first couple of phases. But any larger plot or coordinated resistance effort was simply not feasible because of that same spatial arrangement. However, later, after Stangl, quote, cleaned up the camp and reorganized it, some of the measures he took at increasing the, quote, killing efficiency of Treblinka again worked in favor of the Jewish planners. For instance, the consolidation into a single barrack located further away from escape routes meant individual paths to escapes were potentially shut down, but planning for something larger became easier. As you stated, quote, through the loss of anonymity would hurt prisoners' ability to smuggle in new arrivals or escape unnoticed by the guards. The same factor would also increase inmate knowledge of one another and the ability to form lasting bonds. End of your quote. In terms of the actual revolt itself, again, your meticulous scholarship is readily apparent as you best show in how you track Jewish placemaking in, by your words, quote, testing the memories of survivors against the geography of their lives and comparing multiple witness statements. Herein, I think you have to walk a tightrope because you inevitably go into some dark places since that was the reality of the interior spatial makeup of the camp. You're spot on, though, when you talk about the death or perhaps killing of a possible informant during the escape, to which you state, quote, what we cannot know about those possibilities, and even more, what we cannot understand of the desperate circumstances in which inmates lived, makes any judgment of their deeds inappropriate. End of your quote. I'm personally a huge adherent to Primo Levi's concept of the gray zone and how survival in camps, in his case Auschwitz, specifically meant adhering to an enforced morality that was upside down that was enforced by those who built the spaces. And Levy, of course, wrestled with his whole life afterwards by asking himself, yes, I survived Auschwitz, but was I also a good person? Or perhaps he also asked himself, even though I survived, was my survival worth it if it meant compromising my pre-war morality to adapt to the gray zone of the camp's morality? While all of the rest of us would, of course, let Levy and survivors like him off the hook, recognizing the choiceless choices he faced and the miraculous nature surviving any of these places, survivors themselves, those who lived it, clearly understood the horrific psychological torture side of the death camp experience. And so I completely agree. We absolutely cannot and should not judge, and I'm frankly glad that we don't have to. But I found it insightful, for example, in that same context, how you talk about suicide and how the rates of suicide go down, as you mentioned in your talk, after the reorganization of the camp. But namely because the collective planning for a larger revolt seemed to create bonds of, again, hope isn't the right word, but at least purpose. Speaking of suicide, I think, again, you show a delicate but masterful touch in highlighting how revolt planners had to resort to perhaps unsavory or unspeakable things to ensure the revolt stayed secret. For example, as you say, they used the dark logic and dark reality of Treblinka to weed out wink leaks, and it was very dark logic, of course. But even there, use something like suicide as a spatial method of exerting control over both potential informants, but also in beating the SS at their own game. The latter, this beating the SS at their own game, which is kind of how I understood what you were saying, was really the story for me that kept coming to mind when reading about how Jewish planners consistently use their roles to work for them, such as positioning the appropriate people in the right places, selecting people from transports, especially early on, and most of all, recognizing the horrific situation that they were in. But instead of panicking at being unable to alter the bigger picture, they thought critically about their own essential role in the killing machinery and how they could exploit it to their advantage, and often without the SS or the auxiliary guards even knowing. Or as you put it more directly, quote, Phase 3 prisoner resistance harnessed geographic changes to living arrangements meant to end escape and deployed them in service of their far grander plans. End of your quote. Nowhere was this more evident, perhaps, than in your recognition that successful planning took leadership that could move beyond more organic bonds of hometown relationships and work details to create a more unified plan of action. In terms of the larger spatial narrative you lay out in terms of resistance affected within space at Treblinka, I really appreciated the mastery of timescales. In my own work on Treblinka, my methodology of widening the lens of Treblinka's zones of witnessing often meant sidestepping deeper discussions about change over time. A major strength of your work is identifying the four phases of the camp as laid out by Richard Glazar, but I think defined by you for the first time. It's critical to realize that Treblinka did not exist as one homogeneous space for its 18 months of existence. There was major change as time progressed. And the camp as it existed when the first transports rolled from Warsaw in July 1942 was vastly different from the camp that existed on August 2nd during the revolt of 1943. Especially in the first two chapters, but really consistent throughout, is your complete cognizance of where events occurred within the timeline of Treblinka. When it comes to being able to trace the threads of revolt planning and how spatial changes altered that planning, one cannot be unsure or waver in their understanding of where they are in the timeline. Uh, and you certainly know exactly where you are at all times. As another testament to the brilliance of your methodology, I think, is that as you changed perspectives, such as the shift to identifying women and then later defining survivorship, you still keep the parameters defined by the different phases you identify early on. This makes for an incredibly consistent approach that reinforces your findings on several occasions. So, just a few more thoughts here, and then I'll wrap up. On the back end of the temporal arc here, uh, is your observation about how you list or how your list of survivors expands the dates by which we can understand the last known survivor of Treblinka, which is a powerful observation of both our own missed opportunities, but also in giving recognition beyond a mere limited definition of survivorship. In a world where we don't have Treblinka survivors left by really any accounting anymore, and have less every day for the Holocaust more broadly, you're spot on with the quote that, quote, historians would be wise to get in front of this coming wave of media definitions and experiential descriptions by providing their own. Indeed, we should. I agree with you, lest we get behind in that particular moment. This speaks to really the final point I want to make about your work today, and that's the ongoing conversational style you have throughout. This gets more pronounced as the chapters go on and is especially prevalent in the last chapter. But I applaud your approach in directly speaking to your readers in many places about the efficacy of your own methodology in examining other spaces of the Holocaust. This openness does two things in my mind. First, it invites readers to let their guard down in terms of weighing the power of your scholarship. In other words, you recognize the inherent limitations of researching a place like Treblinka and the specific issues you are looking at. But instead of letting those stop you or scare you off from publishing your findings, you steer into this uncertainty by recognizing the limits and encouraging others to take up the torch, which is a tall order, given just how much ground you did make with your impeccable scope and depth of research. The second thing about this open approach that it does is it cements your book within the conversation about Treblinka and survival during the Holocaust. You have a very clear sense of who your audience is, and while you lay down the gauntlet with this incredible and original contribution to the field, you address other scholars with a level of humility and encouragement to take up that mantle that I found really empowering. So, to return full circle to where I started these comments, your scholarship is on full display from start to finish in Survival at Treblinka. And instead of simply carving out a space for yourself, which you clearly do, you invite others into this conversation with a clear demarcation of what you were able to do and what you weren't able to do. Rare is the book that so adroitly and clearly understands its own strengths, but also its own limits. And how you go about positioning yourself in the larger pantheon of work on Treblinka and the Reinhard camps more generally all but guarantees no one will ever be able to speak about this history again without mentioning your name, your methodology, and your contributions. On a personal note, I was so impressed with this book and commend you, Chad, on a remarkable achievement. The depth of your research is truly incredible. And to anyone watching today, I would strongly encourage you to run out and get and read your copy of Survival at Treblinka. It will certainly change your perspective of the Holocaust on many levels. So well done and congratulations, Chad, truly.
Thank you so much, Jacob, for that wonderful commentary, and thank you again to Chad. We have time for a couple of questions. I learned that the chat had not been enabled during the presentation, but it's open now. So if anyone has any other questions, I've gotten a couple. Please feel free to send them. We have time for about quick questions, Chad, just to give you an idea of timing. So the first question we have that just came through is, thank you very much. Have you worked on Nazi sources for this project? And if yes, what new information can they provide about resistance?
Making sure I'm not muted. Well, thank you so much to Jacob for that incredibly kind response. Can't thank you enough, and to Hannah for doing hosting duties today. I did use Nazi sources for this project. That is in sense of prisoner guard testimonies. Actually, about 4 feet away from me, there's two whole shelves full of prisoner guard testimonies from the various trials after the war, and a bit from things like Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, where he interviews one of the guards quite famously. What I tried to do with those is just kind of look in them for resistance, which is rarer in a guard testimony because they have a vested interest in a court setting, in particularly the German legal system. They have a vested interest in not identifying any particular Jewish person because identifying an individual could lead to different charges. So they want to avoid things that could lead to direct uh, identification unless they're talking about someone who's deceased. And they have a vested interest, perhaps, maybe not even a realized vested interest in not discussing resistance, because it makes them look sometimes foolish or just not like good guards. I don't even know if that's always a conscious reaction, but it is one that sort of works its way through our discussions throughout the field more broadly of what guards are willing to say. They don't generally make themselves look bad at the hand of Jews, so they don't discuss resistance quite well there. I'll end this by saying I didn't use the lion's share of the source work for this is Jewish voices. And also, there's a great deal of times where if you dug into the footnotes, you'll note that I'm citing German sources, German voices, but I don't bring them into the narrative very much at all. And that was a conscious choice. I thought that they'd done enough talking and uncovering so many more survivors of Treblinka. I was trying to make a new opportunity for Jews to take this narrative and to leave the Nazi formulation of what Treblinka was in the history where it already is.
Thanks so much. Okay, so another question, if I can use chair privilege to ask one that I'm curious about.
Yeah,
Chad, you're also an oral historian, so you carry out oral history interviews. You're working on a new oral history project, and you've incorporated oral history into this book in really exceptional ways. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that and how, I guess, your methodology has influenced. Your own writing and this work and what we know and understand about Treblinka.
sure. So I think of oral history as a trustable source. It's one that you try to verify against its geography, like I very specifically do in the book. Uh, if I'm reading an account, I trust it until there's a verification that says I need to worry about it. So that I think is a change, though. The reason why I bring that up, it's maybe it's something that the field has gotten beyond, but maybe not what Treblinka research had gotten beyond quite so much. When Yitzhak Arad brought out his monumental Belzec Sobibor Treblinka, the book that sort of is the gold standard on Aktion Reinhard research, that was 1985. There were less testimonies about Treblinka at that time, and there was less reliance upon oral history in the historical profession writ large. So I kind of thought of myself as doing history on the inside of Treblinka with oral history in some ways for the first time, or thinking of those as the premier source for my work for the first time. Whereas, others might have earlier been looking more for documentation or court trial records, etc. I was leading with the oral histories, and where I thought they were not, you can maybe hear me trying to be very kind to them with language. I always think that there's a reason to critique them or a way to critique them properly. Like if they're a male voice who's not speaking of women, I go, okay, why? This is still a finding. We're still learning from this oral history. It's still a great source. It's maybe just that it's a great source on what that individual doesn't want to say, and that what they don't want to say becomes part of our story, and maybe even, um, for my money, actually, my favorite parts of what I've written here are those parts where I'm commenting on what people don't want to say, um, and what we haven't known for so long. Those are the parts that I'm probably most proud of, and they are a outgrowth of how you use oral history.
Fantastic, thank you. So I think we have time for a couple quick questions. So one that was sent to me was whether you see a similar reluctance to include women as part of the survival story in other Holocaust sites and situations beyond Treblinka.
Yeah, I think we have. I think we have. I think we're still very early. If the historical profession is several years into a revision of including uh, women's voices and women into Holocaust histories, we still have a lot of work to do and a lot of work to go back and refresh now that we're taking that broader look. So, who are all the voices we have for example, of survival at Auschwitz? Um, ho- Almost all of the best known voices there are Jewish men. We probably still have, I guess I would end it by saying it is, I will want to admit, asking me to get a little bit beyond the scope of what I know very, very well. I even find it a little iffy to call myself an expert on Treblinka. I know a few things about that place, but I'm definitely not an expert about the entire Holocaust or even the entirety of that history. So it's my thought that you're going to find a lot more examples of what we can learn from what we don't say and what hasn't been written. I'm just not entirely prepared to say where exactly that's going to be, but I think it's a issue writ large. It's going to be everywhere.
Fantastic, thank you. And we have the perfect last question to end the session for today, which is, can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on next?
Sure. So I'm a completely foolish person, so I'm working on two things at once. Um, and those are a co-authored book with my colleague Ashley Walters, dealing with the very localized history of a little shtetl called Kalushyn in Poland, which is just to the east of Warsaw. And it's amazingly intertwined history between Kalushyn and Charleston, South Carolina. It's a book project that emerges from the fact that Ashley Walters runs a Center for Southern Jewish Culture, and I run our Center for Holocaust Studies. And there's this town where 20% of Charleston's Jews came from. It's just an amazing story of chain migration and then a story of the Jewish 20th century through these two intertwined places. And I'm really excited about the work that we're early in the phases of there. And secondly, my next solo authored monograph would be solo authored monograph would be following Treblinka survivors' lives to their natural conclusion and looking at what is the inheritance of this history. Um, most, as Jacob noted, we believe that all Treblinka survivors have left us now. The last survivor of the revolt was Samuel Willenberg, who passed away in 2016 when I had just begun corresponding with him as a wee uh, master's student. Um, and the rest, Leon Ritz in Sweden, is probably the last Treblinka survivor to pass away just more recently. So the torch has been passed, and a lot of people are starting to look into this research on what that means for Jewish families, for collective memory, for what we're going to know about the Holocaust in the future, who's going to speak about these issues. And what I would like to do is a much more localized look uh, at that phenomenon. And maybe I'll end on one of the things that's sort of popping out to me is a lot of people are working on, this is kind of my preview of something that's fascinating me right now. A lot of people are working on inherited trauma. I think there was not enough focus on inherited pride. and I keep envisioning a chapter called Good Yichus, and it's about the pride of the sons and daughters of Treblinka survivors that I've met. You've never seen a face glow like you do seeing a son or daughter of a Treblinka survivor describe what their parent endured and who they were after and how much that means to them. Uh, I've never seen a pride like that. So I think inherited trauma is incredibly important. It began me down this road, to be clear, but inherited pride and other emotions that come from that is of equal interest to me.
Great. Thank you so much. We all have a lot to look forward to, clearly, and we expect great things. And yeah, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. And thank you to Sky for organizing it, and Jacob for your really insightful commentary. And thank all of you for joining us for the Global Mosse Lecture Series. It's been a real pleasure. So thank you all so much.
Thank you.